Alrighty, so welcome everyone. We're glad that you're able to join us today. We have the great honor of having a presentation on space repetition, and we have the great honor of having Martin Schneider, who is the founder and the CEO of RemNote, which is an online space repetition uh, system, and he's a graduate of for bachelor's and master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he founded the company during college. So we're glad that he's able to join us.
Thanks so much for having me. Cool. Maybe we can jump right into it. Let me screen share here. Can everyone see this okay? Someone just see Joe Moon give us some. Okay, cool. Okay, great. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. So today I'm going to try to tell you about how you can forget about forgetting by learning effectively with spaced repetition. So by the end of the talk, you'll have a hopefully much better idea of how you can remember what you've learned for the MCAT, your university classes, and beyond by minimizing your study time and maximizing understanding and mastery. The talk will have a few different parts. So we're going to start with some background and theory on learning science to help you understand where we're coming from and how you can leverage that learning science for effective study. We're then going to do an interactive walkthrough of how you can learn with spaced repetition in this tool called RemNote that we're building. We're then going to talk through the most important 20 rules for how to study effectively, or in particular, use spaced repetition. And then I'm going to hand it off to Mohammed here, who is a current second-year med student, and he's going to talk about some even more specific tips for how you can succeed in the MCAT and your medical career beyond. So we're going to try to do some learning theory, but also just have a ton of practical tips so that you can go and directly apply it in your studies right after the talk. Cool. So maybe let's jump into it first by stepping back and thinking about what the actual process of being an effective doctor or effectively solving problems on medical related tests are. And let's try to go through and solve this sort of clinical vignette together here, which is sort of a simulated medical problem. So if we read it together, we see that it's asking us about a 2-week-old newborn who's presenting with yellowing of the skin and sclera. Laboratory tests have revealed elevated levels of unconjugated bilirubin, and the neonate's liver enzyme has low levels of UGT. And then from that, we need to decide what of the following conditions are most likely. When we see this problem, we can take a moment or two to try to analyze it and identify the most important parts of it. And we can write them down here, which are the yellowing of the skin and sclera, elevated bilirubin, low UGT, and that they're in the neonatal period. But after we analyze that, what we can do directly here is almost over. And the rest of the work is about pulling a lot of ideas from our long-term memory. And in general, both for medicine and in many other subjects, the hardest part of solving many problems is generally about bringing in the relevant prior examples, bringing in prior knowledge, and then leveraging that to solve the problem. So here, if we write down everything that we need to remember, we need to first recognize that this condition is called jaundice. And then we need to remember that it's caused by elevated bilirubin. And then for each of the individual possible causes here, we need to be able to identify if it's a low amount of UGT and what age it normally appears at. And then only once we have all that information brought from our long-term memory, then we can go through and really quickly compare it against the actual symptoms here. So we can see that there's a low amount of UGT in the blood, so that matches both with Gilbert syndrome and Crigler-Najjar here. And we're in the neonatal period, which means that it matches only with Crigler-Najjar as the sort of answer here. The point of going through that is that in general, memory is sort of the bottleneck here. And sorry, by the way, are the slides blocked? I'm not sure if you're also seeing this at a pop-up. That's fine. So yeah, the problem here is that memory is human memory is sort of unstable, and forgetting is natural and is the default. And without repetitions, you will forget whatever you're trying to learn, and you won't be able to apply it effectively on your exams. If you want to get that high grade, be it an A plus or just passing the exam or whatever your goals are, then remembering is required, and especially for the MCAT and then later in med school and for the step one, you need to be able to bring a vast amount of medical, biology, chemistry, physics, etc. knowledge to succeed. So if you're studying for years, it's worth figuring out how to do it effectively, to get higher results in grades in less study time. Maybe first, just for a moment, if you think back to a class that you took a year ago, if you just want to put in the chat, how much of it do you think you remember? Where five is like everything, one is that you remember like nothing. Maybe just some people want to put that in there. I think for most people, the number can often be sort of alarmingly low. And it was that case for me. And when you look at studies that try to track how well people remember what they're learning, you see these somewhat alarming statistics where for this one here, for example, even a student who was an A student when they initially took the class, their grade on effectively a final exam of what they retained dropped all the way down to like a C only a year later, and then down to a D even a year after that. So knowledge decays very quickly here. For some very brief background on me, um, uh, I was a computer science student at MIT, and did my master's, and a brief PhD, which I dropped out of there to focus on Remnote. I've been using space repetition for 7 years, and I've written 45,000 space repetition cards with 300,000 practice interactions. Also competed at the USA Memory Championship. And I say this just because I'm a bit obsessed with space repetition and effective learning. And the reason I got obsessed with it wasn't that I was good at it originally. I think my memory is actually really quite poor. And because it's so poor, I felt that I really needed to figure out how I can remember things effectively. Initially, I thought this was actually just a problem that only I had, where after my freshman year of college, I was going through and just trying to think back and get ready for the next semester. And I was realizing that I had forgotten, honestly, almost everything that I had learned in my freshman year. That was quite alarming, both in terms of being able to be prepared for my following sophomore and future years, as well as just being able to apply what I had learned further on in my career. So I started trying to look into what the best science-proven study strategies were. And then over the next few years, I found and learned about everything that I'm going to try to tell you now so that you can get it all in sort of one condensed hour rather than having to go through it in the same way that I did. So first, I would recommend sort of breaking down your study process into these three main steps here. And this is sort of how I go through it. First, I'll go through an sort of initial learning period where I'll go to lectures, take notes, and then after that, I'll watch videos or do extra reading on anything that I immediately can tell that I'm already confused by. Often it's very hard to get all the details immediately during lecture. It's easy to zone out. Maybe the teacher didn't say something very clearly, and you shouldn't expect to get everything in a single pass. After that, my goal is to try to start building mastery there, where both in lecture, but also later on, I'm writing notes, trying to capture an understanding of what I'm being told, making flashcards from my notes, and then studying them daily with spaced repetition. And then finally, closer to the exam, I'll go and do practice exam questions and do some final spaced repetition flashcard practice. If we go and look at the learning science here, one of the most important uh, things to understand is this model that there's two main kinds of memory. There's long-term memory, which is long-lasting storage and has a large capacity, but it's somewhat hard to put things into there. And then there's short-term memory, which is brief retention, sort of a limited capacity of like 7 ± 2 items at once. And there are definitely overlapping brain regions for all these. It's not a totally strict distinction, but I think it's a very useful model just to keep in your head while you're thinking about learning. Your goal is to get as much as you can from your short-term to your long-term memory. And the reason from that is that when you're trying to solve problems, you want to get to this goal of automaticity. Whereas when you read, for example, that initial problem we looked at about jaundice, when you see that there is a like yellow skin or yellow eyes, you immediately automatically then want to say, oh, jaundice, and just immediately have that come out the top of your head. While you're going through an exam, or especially while you're talking to a patient, you don't want to be struggling to remember these symptoms or other core clinical knowledge. You want it to be automatic. Automaticity here is just defined as being able to do things without occupying your mind with the low-level details, going through that sort of more manual retrieval process here. And especially for the MCAT, with the pace that you need to get through questions, you want it to be quite effective or quite efficient for as much of the core knowledge as you can. Then again, while we're learning, our goal is first to be to try to understand the content, but then to store it as effectively as we can in long-term memory. A core distinction to make here is active learning versus passive learning. Passive learning is listening to a lecture, rereading, highlighting things that can feel good in the moment and are a core part of learning in that you need to get the initial knowledge somehow, but it can't be the only way you learn. For a while, I liked to just sort of listen and lecture and not really write anything down. I was focused and I was paying attention, but then I realized I just had to go and honestly relearn most of it afterwards. To avoid that, being active and doing active learning is unfortunately just sort of necessary here. You need to be able to both take notes when you're initially learning, go through practice problems, make flashcards, and practice flashcards. And the reason for this is that we need to be able to sort of train our brain that this is knowledge that we really want in our long-term memory. If we then look at once we get that knowledge into our long-term memory, even then, unfortunately, you're not done. All knowledge in your memory is subject to what's called the forgetting curve here, where on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have the number of days since we initially learned something. And on the y-axis here, we have our retention, just which is the probability of being able to successfully recall it and pull that knowledge to the front of your mind. You can see that it decays exponentially here. The exact shape depends on the exact difficulty of what you're learning, how well connected it is to other ideas in your mind. But the core thing to remember here is just that decaying is exponential. And when you notice this for yourself, it's not just you that's experiencing it. It's a very universal thing, both across individuals and across all domains of study. To fight the forgetting curve, we need to leverage active learning. And in particular, we need to go through a process called active recall. I'm sure that you all have used flashcards, and flashcards are a perfect example of this. If we ask ourselves what Gilbert's syndrome is here, then actively pulling out the definition or whatever details we want to know from our long-term memory starts to train our brain that this is knowledge that we want to retain and helps us start to fight that forgetting curve. When you go through that active recall process, you're bringing knowledge from your short-term to your long-term memory. And this is doing a few different things. First, it's telling your brain that the knowledge is important, which helps to strengthen neural connections and get the neural pathways here to fire together more consistently. It's also helping you to leverage metacognition and help you notice when you're confused, or if you're struggling on either a flashcard or some homework, that you then go and reread the part of the textbook here, or somehow fix the underlying confusion. And it also helps you uh, train yourself to recognize that knowledge in a wider set of contexts. Then, as we're doing active recall, we can temporarily boost our understanding or our chance of retrieving the idea back up to 100% here. And then the question is, at what intervals should you go through and schedule your repetition practice? Surprisingly here, and sort of core to spaced repetition, the finding is that you don't need to go and practice every detail every week or every month or even every year. Instead, the intervals for optimal practice here expand exponentially, where when you first start to learn something, you do need to practice it a day later, then a few days later, and then a week later, and so on. But every time you practice, if you practice it at the right time, just when you're about to forget that knowledge, then your next interval will grow exponentially from there until getting to months and then years. Research here has been going on for 150 years at this point, starting with Hermann Ebbinghaus here, who started by just trying to memorize these word lists, where he would give himself a big list of these words, try to remember them, and then test himself a week later, a few weeks later, and so on. And he started to map out for himself how much he forgot on each of these words to calculate that retrieval percent. Since then, this has become one of the most replicated results in psychology, spaced repetition has. And there's this really nice survey paper here from Sarma et al., where they tried to go through and surveyed hundreds of papers to find any domain which was not subject to this forgetting curve. But the unfortunate result was that everything just seems to be forgotten at this exponential forgetting curve unless you fight back on it with spaced repetition. This is, of course, very unfortunate because I would like to remember everything forever. But we just need to accept that this is sort of unavoidable. And then we need to figure out how we can organize our practice to fight the forgetting curve most effectively. Early systems that tried to prevent this were very manual. For example, there's the Leitner system here, where you would put things in boxes, where things would start in box number 1. If you remembered it correctly, it would go to box number 2, which you would review on like a weekly basis. Box number 3, you would review on like a monthly basis. And you can still do this, of course, just in a very manual way with flashcards in boxes here. Nowadays, it's much more efficient to use an automated space repetition tool, which give you a queue of cards to practice on every day. And for each individual card, they'll automatically compute for you the optimal day on which you need to practice something. They do this by looking at the grades that you give yourself on each individual card. So here you can see that if I forgot something, it'll come back in a minute just so I can check myself on it again. But based on how easy it was for me to recall it, it'll come back in this case in different number of months from now. But again, these eventually will become years. The two main tools that people use here are Anki, which is very popular, and then also Remnote, also quite popular, and that's full disclosure, the tool that I'm building here. And again, this is very much just honestly me trying to solve my own memory here, along with now a million other students. Um, then in terms of the actual underlying model that these tools use here for how to schedule out that next date, they are modeling out three different main parameters for each individual card. And I think it's useful to understand while using the tool so that you know what's going on. The first parameter here is the stability. And this effectively says how quickly the knowledge will decay along this exponential here. And as you continue to practice something, the stability gets higher and higher, which means that this forgetting curve gets more and more shallow. This is just one of the fortunate discoveries that have been made about human memory, again, where the stability increases as you keep practicing it. We don't need to keep reviewing every single thing every week. Then the second parameter here, or the second part of the model, is retrievability, which again is the probability of being able to retrieve a piece of knowledge at a given time. So the model tries to figure out for each individual card when you're going to drop to, in practice, around like 85%, I'd say is optimal. This is showing like 60, but 85% has been shown to be around the optimal here. So when we expect you to have an 85% chance of remembering something successfully in just like 10 or so seconds, then that's when the tool will show you the card. And that's sort of striking a balance between not showing you cards too quickly, while also letting you forget it just a bit enough so that when you practice it, we're able to bump up that stability there. And then third, for each individual card, the tool is trying to model the difficulty of it. Some knowledge just sticks in your head better if it's connected to something memorable for you, or maybe it has less components, and those don't need to be tested quite as frequently. Who uses spaced repetition? Well, as you guys probably know, basically all med students for step one and for their classes. Um, Quite a lot of pre-med students for the MCAT as well. Jeopardy winners, and really people serious about learning from all domains here. At the same time, I don't want you to get the misconception that this is just about sort of like rote memorization or cramming knowledge in your head. Spaced repetition really, and just having a strong foundation in your memory in general, is core to building up understanding so that again, when you're trying to solve some problem, you don't need to be struggling to remember what bilirubin is or what Gilbert syndrome is. They can just automatically come to your head. So then you can focus on the efficient reasoning there. Talking again about some of the specific tools here, um, the first one that you can use is, and well, I'll have links to both these tools at the end of the talk. You can use whichever one you want, of course. The first one here is called Anki. The way it works is you effectively have a giant database. Each row here is a card that you're trying to practice. And you can see that then each of the rows, each of the notes they're called here, has a few different fields of information that can appear on the card. And the tool organizes these cards into decks, and then it will automatically tell you each day that you need to go through and practice out these 20 cards today to ensure that you don't forget them because they're right again at that critical like 85% chance of being able to remember them effectively. The tool that I and my team are building is called Remnote, which is basically taking Anki and trying to combine it with Notion or Google Docs so that you can make your cards yourself right while you're in lecture or in your notes here. You can basically think of the notes as the same in Notion or Google Docs. Flashcards are the same as Anki. And then we also try to help you schedule for a specific exam, PDFs, sort of an all-in-one tool. You can use it totally for free here. So I'm just trying to get you the best tool that you can. I started building Remnote when I was a student myself after using Anki for a bit because I realized that I just really needed to be able to make my own cards to understand what I was learning in lecture. And it's also used by a million plus students now. But again, we'll have links both to Remnote and Anki at the end of the talk. As a brief pop quiz, if we take a look back at that initial clinical vignette that we looked at, how many of you guys really remember what Gilbert syndrome is, Crigler-Najjar is, physiological jaundice? We didn't really go through a proper learning experience for them on that slide, so it might be unfairly hard to remember these here. But even if we had learned them, I just wanted to emphasize that if you're not really going through that active learning, just sort of listening, then you're not probably going to be mastering the material in the same way that you would if you were writing things down or especially using flashcards later on. Just the unfortunate reality, forgetting is the default here. Okay, so maybe now we can go through a sort of interactive getting started. I'm going to be showing this in RemNote, but if you have Anki installed, you can use that as well. The goal here is just to make sure that you come away with something very concrete by the end of the talk, so that you can immediately start using it. So maybe we can just take 30 seconds here, where if you just go to remnote.com/premedcc, again, I'd recommend doing this as we go through the next like 10 minutes of slides here together, just so that you immediately can hit the ground running after the talk here. Um, you can use it free forever. You get a free month of pro features. So I'll just wait for a moment here. Um, I'm not sure. Yeah. So I see one question. So SRS is referring to space repetition system. Um, I sometimes just honestly say it synonymously with space repetition, but it's just referring to either like Anki or RemNote, the system that's trying to organize your and automatically schedule out your space repetition for you here. Any other quick questions? Otherwise, maybe if anyone else wants to sign up there. Okay, well, we'll also have time for questions at the end. So again, please do try to follow along here. It'll make the learning more efficient. Okay, so first, when you sign up, the first thing I'd recommend doing is just getting organized in your sidebar. In general, being organized with your class notes, I found to be very useful. You can do this in whatever note-taking tool you use. Here, the way I organize it for myself is I have a folder for each class that I'm in, and then for each of my lectures, I'll go and make a document for my notes for that lecture. When I go to lecture, I'll spend the majority of my time trying to identify important pieces of information that the lecturer is saying, and then directly turn those into flashcards by thinking about exactly what I want to remember. So first, if you go and create a document, again, if you're following along, please try to do this now. Just click create on the left and then document. Then directly in the document anywhere, you can type the question, whatever you want, on the front of the card, then this equal sign twice. You'll see that it automatically turns into an arrow like this, and then you can type the answer on the back of the card. And this is immediately turning into a flashcard here. If you then click the preview button on the right, you can see that it's making a flashcard that you can directly go through, and that's immediately a space repetition card. And again, if anyone is struggling or has questions, just pop them in the chat. I can see that there. You can also make flashcards with AI, where if you type out the front of your card, which is, again, a useful sort of metacognition thing, where you're helping to identify what you want to focus on. After you type the double equals, then if you press tab, it can automatically write the answer for you, just to save you some typing while you're in lecture. To practice cards, you can click on flashcards on the left here, and then on the top right, in this blue button, click practice today's cards. And this will find all the cards across all your folders or documents that you need to practice today. In Anki, this is sort of the same on the homepage, the deck list there, where you can just click on a single deck and get all the due flashcards. Again, this is based on the cards that you're just about to forget. So it is somewhat important to go through this every day, every other day, not let them sit for too long. When you're practicing, you really want to practice with active recall, where you read the front of the card and then you pause for a moment, let the answer come to your mind, and then only then press show answer. Once you do, then the grades will pop up at the bottom, and you can grade yourself based on how long it took you, how easy it felt, and if you got other information, correct or not. To practice for an individual document or folder, you can go to the top right of any document or folder here and press the practice button. So for example, if you make a folder just for your MCAT study or a folder for a specific class, you can target your practice just for the part that you care about for your current needs. To make multiple cards, you can do this in a single document as well by just adding multiple different bullet points. So here I am just first asking myself what the mitochondria produces, where it's located, what's the unique amount versus other organelles. And you can see that every single bullet here is turning into a flashcard just because I've typed the double equals sign here to create the arrow, which is again the front and back of the card. Press enter to make a new line here, And again, just question, double equals, answer to make a card. You can also organize your cards here with indentation. And this, I think, is very important, both because it helps you make your cards faster, as well as it starts to help you figure out how you're going to organize your ideas yourself in your head. So here you'll notice that all these cards are talking about the mitochondria, right? So it'd be useful to start to organize that together in our head so we can start to think about what the mitochondria produces, its location, and what's unique about it. I can rewrite the notes like this, where I write a single bullet for mitochondria, and then I just press the enter and then the tab key to indent it, and then just write quick terse questions like this, and only a few words for each, where I'm asking myself the same questions as before, but just in less words. And you can see that because it's indented here, it'll still include the sort of like parent bullet, the one that's indented underneath on the card. So this one is saying just where located, but it's also including mitochondria there. So then you can type less here and still get nicely organized notes and organize things in your head as you go. There are a few different card types here, both in Notion, both in Remote and Anki. The first is a single line card here, where you can type the question, and then again, the double equals, and then your answer. You can also put multiple lines on the back of your card by typing the equal sign not only twice, but 3 times. And you'll see that it automatically moves down with this sort of bold line on the left here and the arrow pointing down. And then you can put any knowledge that you need on the back of the card here. It'll test you on it all at once. You can also make a fill in the blank card, which is very useful for when you're pulling in existing notes from a book or from lecture notes or something like that, where if you just paste in some existing text, you can then select the part of it that you want to test yourself on. In this case, you can see I've selected mitochondria here, and then press this sort of brackets with the 3 little dots on them. When you do that, it'll turn it into a flashcard like this, where it's testing you on specifically the part that you had selected, in this case, mitochondria, and asking me to review that. And yep, this will all be recorded after, so you don't need to memorize all this quite as we're going. You can also do the same thing here with images. So if you paste in an image, you can then either press this button here to have it automatically identify all the pieces of text on it, or you can just draw a box yourself over each piece of text or thing that you want to remember, and then it will make cards like this, where it's testing you on each individual box that you drew. So testing you to recall in this case, this part of the anatomy diagram. In terms of what to actually do in lecture here, again, I would mostly focus on trying to make flashcards because that sort of kills 2 birds with 1 stone. You're both getting your notes as well as you're immediately setting yourself up for success after to leverage spaced repetition practice. To do this, I first just try to keep an ear out for any important seeming terms. So I'll write down mitochondria, ribosome, nucleus, and so on, and those form the core of the notes that I'm taking. I'll then write down a question for each important sounding piece of information that I hear the lecturer say. So again, if I start hearing them talk about that the mitochondria is the power cell of the cell, it produces ATP and so on, I'll just write down a really terse sentence here, enough for me to be able to remember and test myself on the concept later on. It doesn't need to be like a full sentence or anything. It's good, honestly, to personalize it in a terse way for yourself. And then I'll just keep doing that. It's a pretty simple process where I just need to stay on top of it and just keep writing flashcards as I go. It helps me stay focused and engaged here, helps me to understand and connect ideas, and it also gets me flashcards to practice right after. If we go through this as sort of a little demo here, where we have this paragraph on the left, well, first we see that the lecturer is talking about mitochondria, so I'll write that down. We see that they mention that it's a membrane-bound cell organelle, so I can ask myself what it's bounded with. Then I type the double equal sign to get the arrow, and I can just press tab for the AI tab complete here. I can then see if we're talking about the purpose of the cell, that I can write that down as the card. And then finally, if we're talking about ATP, I'll add a new bullet for ATP here and add a new question asking myself what it stores, if that's the most important piece of info that the lecturer said yet. And here I only had to type these 12 words on the front of the card here. The backs were written with the AI tab completion, which is basically always honestly what you want. Because it's not much typing, I was able to sort of stay in focus and stay in flow as I was learning here. Maybe let me try to really quickly switch to a demo of my notes. Hopefully you guys can still see this. So I pulled out some of just my notes as sort of an example here. And again, I just sort of organize all of my different folders for the classes that I'm focused on. These are just some of my very old ones, just as an example. But again, for each lecture, I'll go and add a new document for that lecture. In my case, I like to organize my notes with different headers, but then I'll just be writing different questions for each of the important pieces of knowledge that I come across. Um, I'll also organize my like to-dos or my reading list in here. And in general, I just find it very useful to have a single organized place that I can organize all my notes. And then each day I'll just try to click on the left here to practice the spaced repetition cards that are due each day. And honestly, that's basically my main study habits here. It's all sort of baked into that flow. Okay, jumping back here. We went through a lot there, so if anyone has questions, please shoot them in the chat. Also, in Remnote, you can always search in the bottom left for any questions. And for Anki, you can just go on to the link that we have at the end and search their help tutorials there as well. Any quick questions there? I don't see any right now. Again, the most important ones are just to type question double equals answer. Yep. So you can also there's like a daily notes feature where you can put things there. And you can also schedule out specific exams there. Um, I guess that's more of like a Remnote thing. Technically, I guess you could do that in Anki too. Yeah. Okay. Well, if anyone has any questions, just as we keep going, feel free to shoot them over. Um, But maybe now we can move on to the sort of next part here, where we've talked maybe very like at a practical level about how you can go through and use a space repetition tool. Let's now take a little bit of a step back and talk about how to actually write cards most effectively. Here, it's the kind of thing where you can start by writing cards super fast. Don't worry about this, like getting the perfect card too much to start, but it's definitely sort of a skill that you can build up over time to write more and more effective cards, both which means cards that are testing you on the most important part, as well as cards that will get you the most leverage on your exam. So before we jump into the real 20 rules, again, rule number 0, I'd say here is just make sure you're like actively taking notes in whatever tool you want, using active recall and using spaced repetition. For a lot of students that I talk to, they sort of let perfectionism get in the way, sort of get overwhelmed by this. Just paying attention, taking notes, and using active recall is already a huge step up here. That said, for part 1, maybe let's talk about how you can think about cards most effectively. The most important rule to start with here is making sure that you really understand something before you memorize it. This is probably the part that I mess up most frequently, honestly, just out of laziness. It's often very tempting to just try to jump immediately to cramming flashcards or just trying to cram something that I don't really understand. And this just never really works. If you lack a stable understanding, then your memories will break down and become useless, and it just won't lead to good exam results either, honestly. Understanding is a bit of a fuzzy word here. And if I tried to pin it down, I'd say that understanding really means resourcefulness in your thinking, which means being able to understand each idea that you're learning from a variety of different angles. So, for example, if we're talking about a medical condition here, you both want to be able to understand its high level causes, as well as its symptoms, its level of pathology, its possible treatments, and so on. Understanding also means connecting it to your existing ideas so that when you're trying to remember what you learned, it's not just a jumble of words that aren't really meaningful to you that's coming back, but a set of like connected ideas, connected concepts that let you leverage real reasoning here. In practice, the most effective way to understand before you memorize is writing notes and cards yourself, I'd say. It's very hard to write notes if you're not actually understanding what you're writing about. And then another very useful thing is trying to just re-explain the topic from end to end. So it's fun to do this with a friend. Often that helps both of you unconfuse yourself, or just like after some lecture, before an exam, just like trying to speak out loud and just like repeat everything you know about a subject. I find very useful too. Second most important rule here that I'd say is make sure you master the basics first and then learn in layers, building on top of those basics. Again, this is probably something that is easy to understand, but I think it's worth emphasizing just because it's so tempting to try to skip over it. Of course, you do want to try to minimize your total practice time here and take as many shortcuts as you can, make sure you're hacking the tests and all that sort of stuff. Um, but you should try to take shortcuts on depth here. Like, don't try to learn the absolute intimate details of every single thing. Instead, focus on really mastering the basics here. So, for example, for the MCAT, don't just try to like pattern match practice problems without understanding low level info. That just really doesn't work in an exam. Instead, you want to try to figure out the highest yield info and then build the automaticity that we talked about earlier for that. In practice, This means generally using a course or a book that orders ideas for you in a way that helps you build up these different layers. Rewriting ideas in your own terms again is very useful. And then if you can notice gaps in your knowledge as you do this and add connections, that helps quite a lot as well. Part two, maybe let's talk a bit about how actually to write cards here. Um, cool. I'm not sure if the slide's working again. Okay, there we go. So here you want to try to write cards as sort of like little triggers where you recognize whatever the front of your card is as a sort of trigger, and then you bring the back of the card to mind. So the front of your card is sort of the set of ideas that you want to be in your head to start here. The set of ideas that you would read on an exam or while you're trying to reason through some problem. And then the back of the card is again just the ideas that you want to pop into your head. For example, for that initial card on jaundice that we went through, we want some card which on the front is something like this, where the core ideas are that like the skin turned yellow and the eyes turn yellow. And as soon as I see that, it's like a trigger automatically activates in my head, and I say, oh, that's jaundice. I automatically recognize that here. Here, the most important thing is to make sure that you're both not being too broad and not being too specific. So if I had a card that was just testing me on like the skin turned a weird color or the like eyes turned a weird color, then that could actually be like a variety of different conditions, right? Or if it's a card that's too specific, where I'm throwing all the details on the front of the card, the skin turned yellow and the eyes turned yellow and this high bilirubin, not enough UGT and so on, then if only one of those were in my head, then I might not necessarily bring jaundice to mind effectively in that context. So you really want it to be at the right level of specificity here. In practice, uh, just try to think about making sure that the triggers will achieve your goals on your exam here, and try to make sure that whatever's on the front of your card matches as closely as possible to what will be on your practice problem or what will be in your head at that point of time. Next, you want to try to break down knowledge into atomic cards where you don't want a giant card like this, where you're asking yourself, what is jaundice? And then you try to list out all the different things that you know on the back. It's both going to be really frustrating when you're trying to practice it, and it's just not going to lead to an effective mastery. Instead, it's sort of an easy fix where if you just take every single bullet that you have on the back, generally you can turn that into its own individual little card, where you ask yourself separately what the symptoms of jaundice are, and then what jaundice is caused by, or what causes an excess of bilirubin in the blood. You can break each of these down into their own little cards. And somewhat counterintuitively here, more cards doesn't always lead to more study time. Because if you're spending a lot of time on a single card, trying to slowly go through and remember each one of these single steps, if going through this card is taking me like 30 seconds, but each of these bullets here is only each taking me 3, then that's going to save you quite a lot of time in the long run. In practice here, all you need to do is just notice long cards and try to rewrite them as smaller ones. Number 5 is to try to organize knowledge into these terms that we were talking about earlier. We call this the concept descriptor framework. That's sort of a needlessly fancy term. All you need to do here is, again, just notice the terms that you think will be important, such as jaundice here, or mitochondria, or ATP earlier, and write them down as their own bullet points, and then organize your other questions underneath them. And then for each of those individual questions, try to write the front of it to be just as short and compact as possible. Then you want to try to break down as many of these concepts as you can hierarchically. For many, many kinds of knowledge, we understand the world in terms of concepts that are organized hierarchically like this. So for the heart, for example, I can think about the heart has both the chambers and then the layers of the heart. And then for the chambers, there's these 4 different ones. And then within those, I have the different kind of muscles, and I can just keep on breaking it down into more and more detail. And by doing this explicitly, when you're writing your cards or writing your notes, you're helping yourself to figure out what that structure is in your head to help prevent you from getting confused there and to have a clear map that you can use for solving problems. In RemNote or in most note-taking tools, you can just use the tab key here to indent bullets underneath each other, and then you can just directly write cards there. Rule number 7 here is to try to avoid sets, which is, again, is like long lists of information like this. And in addition to breaking these up into separate cards, if you can't do that, then you can turn them into ordered lists, where, again, you can split it up like this, or you can break them up into ordered lists here. So there's a subtle difference between these 2 cards here. The one on the left is trying to ask me to recall them all at once, but the one on the right is asking me to go through it in order. And in your flashcard tool, if you put these numbers here, it'll go through and test you on each of them one by one. And here it's very useful for your own thinking to go through these in a consistent way. So here going through, for example, all the chambers of the heart in the order in which blood flows through them, because that both helps you sort of set up your consistent mental pathways here, as well as get through the flashcards faster. It's also very useful here to use mnemonics in practice. So if you're trying to remember like the causes of some disease, for example, then again, giving yourself that consistent order by consistently going through each letter of the mnemonic is another way to add that structure here. Rule number 8 is try to not memorize everything. Each card doesn't cost them that much time in the long term. You can sort of estimate it out that every single card you add will cost around like 2 to 3, let's call it, depends on how hard the card is in terms of total minutes of practice time. Maybe that's a somewhat surprisingly low number, but again, if you're using spaced repetition effectively, these intervals will start to get longer and longer, really quickly getting to like months and years, where if you're going through your queue quickly, it's actually not taking that much total time. So here, that said, you want to really figure out the core knowledge, again, the high yield knowledge that's most important to remember. And then let your flashcards make your sort of core tree of knowledge here, and then add extra knowledge around them in your notes. So there's this like common phrase of like, why do I even need to remember anything at all? Can I just Google it? Can I chat GPT it? Honestly, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but you do need to have the core knowledge memorized because you can't be sort of like Googling while you're talking to a patient about what disease causes yellow eyes, for example, or you can't do that on the MCAT. In practice, you want to add cards for knowledge that is high yield for your exams, or that you need to try to use in your thinking, that you need like really quick access to, that you can't go on Google, but that you want to immediately come to your mind, or that maybe is useful for drawing analogies to, or that you're trying to build future knowledge up on top of. Number 9 is it's very useful to understand what kind of thing each idea is. So, for example, for ethanol, if we're studying for the MCAT, we want to understand that's a chemical compound, or that jaundice is a medical condition. And maybe this sounds kind of obvious, but often I'm realizing that I'm learning something and I don't even know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And as soon as I identify what kind of thing it is, you can start to ask yourself common questions about it. For a medical condition, you can ask yourself about what the causes are, what the treatment is, etc. And then to do this, one very useful tool here is just to structure things into tables like this. So if you just like tag something, each idea by what kind of thing it is, in this case, tagging each part of the periodic table as being an element, then you can sort of structure your knowledge here by trying to memorize the atomic number, the group, et cetera, for each. Maybe these specific details, honestly, you don't need to memorize, but for a medical condition, for example, that would be useful. Number 10 is you really want to try to use concise, consistent questions here. So if you're doing this in a table, the columns sort of make your consistent questions. But in general, you want to write as short of a question on the front of the card as you can. And you'll start to notice over time that there are like pretty consistent questions that you can ask yourself about most things, like what the purpose of it is, or how it was created, or the problem that the thing causes, alternatives, why something is true, and so on. And then if you train yourself to ask these common questions, I think honestly, it both makes you a more effective thinker, as well as when you're thinking through things, if you have a flashcard on this detail, that'll immediately come to mind for you. In practice, and remember that you can type this tilde to add these like quick questions, or you can just write your own consistently named fronts of your flashcard. Rule number 11 here is to build on top of your knowledge by adding what we call leaf knowledge. So this is maybe a little bit of counterintuitive, but for the core high yield ideas, the core foundational knowledge, here you actually want to bias to adding a few extra flashcards. You don't want to be super conservative with having the absolute minimum set here, because it'll actually sometimes lead to taking you more time when you're practicing. Here, adding these extra pieces of like leaf knowledge that's asking you about, for example, like what the color of bilirubin is, or the color of bilirubin, or about these like little extra details that might not be directly relevant to your exam, they can still help to sort of separate out each idea in your mind and then help you to retain the core, more important ideas as well. So here, for example, it's sometimes useful to add like the etymology sometimes for an idea, or if you're really struggling with an idea, add some sort of mnemonic like this, or just figure out whatever is most useful for you to help you remember it more effectively. In practice here, just again decide what the core foundational knowledge is and add slightly more cards than maybe you think might be absolutely necessary there because you really want to make sure you're mastering those basics. To help here, using mnemonics is very effective. So you can either add etymology, for example, trying to understand hematopoiesis in terms of like blood and making. Personally, I find it to be very useful to understand just what the word actually means. Use acronyms, for example, for ocean, for the big five traits you need to know for the MCAT. That's a very useful way of remembering them. And in general, just if you're struggling with an idea, try to find some more memorable way to formulate your card or to formulate the knowledge in your head. One way to help you remember things more effectively is by making connections and expressing ideas in terms of existing ideas that you already know. If you, for example, are learning about endocarditis, you want to be able to write like a really concise back of the flashcard here, which can just be something like inflammation of the endocardium. Again, this isn't all the details you know about endocarditis, but this is just your main first definition for it. And by expressing these two ideas together, you can start to get really concise flashcards that help to make sure that you're at like the wavefront of your knowledge where you're going to have the highest chance of remembering what you're learning. Here, you want to also try to, as much as you can, there's a trade-off here, write your own cards and use sort of like personal, non-standard connections. Writing your own cards helps to ensure that you're building a knowledge that you do understand because you're writing it yourself. If you notice that you're confused while you're writing the card, you can go fix it. And it's also just a good application of active learning. Making personal connections here, especially if they're like weird or rememberable in some way, can be really helpful. As a random example for myself, I was struggling to remember like prone versus supine as just the terms for the body orientation there. And as soon as I made the connection that I can just think of prone as like planking, like the viral planking trend, then that immediately made the connection sort of solved in my head. And I haven't had to think about that since. Here, you want to try to also avoid memory interference between ideas that are too similar to each other. Interference is when you're trying to learn some new idea and it collides with and sort of overwrites an old one. So it's as a very loose analogy, like if you were adding multiple files into your head with the same name, you would have a risk of them overwriting each other. You want to give them separate names and give them separate representations in your head. So here, when you're learning something, you want to think about what's like most closely similar to that you already know, both for the purpose of making connections, but also to understand what's different about them so you can separate them out. For example, again, another random example for myself. At some point, I was learning about the spleen and the kidney and the liver all at the same time. And that was just a very confusing thing to do with them all processing the blood and in slightly different ways. And I needed to go through and sort of manually fix that out for myself by understanding what made them all each different. Similarly, mitosis versus meiosis, these are very similar concepts that are easy to confuse. You want to separate them out in your head. And then make sure that you're writing clear cards here, which ask about a very specific thing and have like a single answer on the back. Asking yourself something like, what part of the body processes blood is a very vague card, and it'll make it very susceptible to this memory interference here, where there's a lot of different possible answers on the back. In practice, this means you want to avoid them learning two similar topics simultaneously. Interleaving interleaving is a good thing later on, but it's better left for once you have an initial understanding of the idea. If you notice that you're confused, do try to pause and fix it, even though it's super annoying and painful. And then it's also useful to add cards that explicitly ask you to contrast ideas. So, for example, for mitosis, asking explicitly about what the difference with meiosis is here could, for example, help you to separate out those terms in your head. Then you also want to keep on trying to make things as personal and visual for yourself as possible. Are a great way to do this, especially if you're learning something like anatomy, and then you can turn those into image occlusion cards here. Also, just like visualizing processes. So, for example, if you were trying to think about how blood flows through the heart, this GIF is actually just a GIF from one of the flashcards I have on this, but you both want to try to do this on your flashcard as well as in your head when that idea comes to mind for any sort of process. Let yourself like play through that story, that movie in your head there. Rule number 17 is that it's very useful to try to make ideas your own as much as you can by renaming things for yourself. Names are, of course, very powerful and they can act as hooks for ideas, but they can also be dangerous if you let yourself just like memorize these as strict words that don't really mean much for you. And many names can be somewhat arbitrary and might not immediately make a personal, meaningful connection. For example, jaundice, which we're talking about here, actually just comes from this old French word of jaunisse, which means yellowness. It was meaningful to the initial people that defined the term, but it's not personally meaningful to me. So for myself, I'm sort of just like renaming this in my notes to just like a yellow skin condition. Again, that's probably not the right answer for you. You want it to be something that's personal and that helps you remember the idea. In practice, rename ideas for yourself, and then also make sure that you're adding some sort of close or card testing yourself on the main name here so that you do still recognize the name if you see it on an exam or in practice. And then finally, practicing effectively is a very important part of spaced repetition as well, where first you want to make sure you're using deliberate practice on each of your spaced repetition cards. Again, here, it should very much feel like a workout when you're going through the flashcards, like going to the gym. You should be tired by the end, unfortunately. Memory isn't really like reading out of a database. You need to go through this process uh, where you're really just like intentionally reading the card, specifying what ideas you want your brain to sort of bring to mind, maintaining those for a bit, then trying to resolve any confusions in your head. All this sort of happens subconsciously, but you need to let yourself focus enough while you're going through your flashcards to go through these steps while you're practicing. And if you keep on doing this, you get faster and faster, both at remembering that specific idea, but in general about leveraging and using your memory effectively here. Here you want to try to get into like memory recall mode, I like to think of it as, while I'm going through my queue. I'll try to set aside just like for these 20 minutes, for the set of hours, whatever. I'm just focused on going through this here. And I can, when I'm not doing it, then I'm just having fun after. So just like explicitly separating them out. And then also just editing and fixing cards that I'm confused about really helps us stay in the flow here and avoid getting frustrated or breaking out of this flow with annoying cards. Similarly, you want to really build a habit here. Consistent practice is key with spaced repetition. Here, I think it's most useful to align this with some other external habit you already have. For me and for students I talk to, this is a lot of different things that you can use here. If you are traveling each day, going through your flashcards on your phone while you're traveling can be very useful. If the bus, not while you're driving, before bed or while you're waking up, while you're waiting for class to start, while you're exercising. I've shifted between all these in the past. It's just whatever is personally the most consistent habit you have right here for you. And then for huge goals like the MCAT or things like that, creating a study roadmap and sticking to it is, again, unfortunately important. There's no real shortcuts here. But you do want to try to maybe just to end here, I'd say, do try to seek out the joy of learning when you're doing it right. It should feel powerful, exciting, impactful, and effortful all sort of at the same time. And for me, I just try to keep visualizing whatever my main goal is. Um, for some of you guys, that might be like visualizing a high MCAT score or high grade in whatever your class is, or just like being successful in your career long term. And then, yep, so that's it for me. And then I'm going to hand it over to Mohammed here, who is a current second year med student. And he is both a current tutor for various undergrads and has taught about how to study effectively. And he's just going to tell you a bit more about study strategies specifically for the MCAT and beyond that has been useful for him and people he's tutored. So if you want to take over the screen share, Mohammed.
All right, thanks, Martin. I don't know if you want to, Martin, do you want to answer the questions that you have in the Q&A right now, or do you want to do them at the end?
Maybe let's say that to the end
We,
if that's okay. Oh,
yeah, we
no.
could do them at the end. Yeah, that'd be perfect.
All right, sounds good. Okay, let me get my slides here. Okay. All right, can you see my screen? Yep, all righty. Okay, let me start this. Let's see. Start from the beginning. Alrighty, so this is my presentation. I don't want to make this too formal, and I want this to be a little less formal, informal, as much as it can be. Let me introduce myself. My name is Mohammed Khan. I'm a second year medical student studying in the Midwest. I'm originally from California, but I moved out here for medical school. I'm currently in my pre-clerkships, and in the next few months or so, I'll be studying for my board exams. So a lot of this content that Martin has been talking about, spaced repetition and using Anki, using RemNote, those types of things are very relevant to my day-to-day. So I'm happy to be here to discuss that, and I'm looking forward to your questions at the end as well. So we'll get started here. All right, so just a little basic overview. I know this is a pre-med oriented group, So obviously as pre-meds, you want to take the MCAT to get into medical school, and also some other programs may use the MCAT for the admissions process. So the MCAT itself is a standard exam, and it's basically testing your critical thinking skills on subjects you've learned through your undergrad. So think of the biological sciences, your chemistry, your physics, your psychology, sociology, and those types of things. So it's essentially a large test testing all that you've learned in your 4 years of undergrad. And it's used by admissions committees, like I mentioned, to determine your readiness for medical school. And this is important because medical school, obviously, it's very rigorous, especially the first 2 years. So you're cramming a lot of knowledge, especially in your first 2 years of pre-clerkships in a very short amount of time. So admissions committees, when they're looking for prospective applicants and prospective individuals that they're going to admit to their university, they want to make sure that you'll be able to pass the course comfortably and you won't be failing out, essentially. They don't want you to fail out. They want you to do the best that you can. So the MCAT basically is a gauging factor of how well you can do in medical. So it's not the only thing, and I'll discuss that a little bit later, but it is an important part of that. So how's it structured? So I did go over this a little bit in the previous slide. So there are 4 sections: the chemistry, physics, bio, the critical analysis reading section, and then the psychology and sociology section. So each section is 59 questions, and all but the car section, they're 95 minutes. So you do have breaks between these sessions, and for the most part, you want to get these done within the time frame. And you can see here that there's approximately 1 minute 36 for the 95-minute section, and then 1 minute 42 for the 90-minute section. And in total, you have 230 questions, and the total seated amount of time is around 7.5 hours. So it's a very long exam. It's done in one day, and essentially you need to build up the stamina while you're studying to get through that testing period. I'll discuss that in a little bit as well. It's graded on a curve, so essentially you're competing in a sense against other people who took that same test on the same day. So if there was a question that trumped everyone, then it wouldn't necessarily hurt you because, again, you're being compared, or the curve essentially is being based on the individual that took the test day on that, the test on that specific day that you took it on. So, okay, so why is the MCAT difficult? Depth. I would say, again, it's a very large test. You're testing multiple subjects, and it's not superficial knowledge. You need to have a good understanding of the knowledge. And like Martin was mentioning, having a good foundation knowledge before getting to the depth is very helpful, and it's necessary in this case. Breadth also, it's, again, 4 sections, so there's a lot of it has to do with understanding multiple disciplines in the sciences, social sciences, how they link together and how they work together. And like I was mentioning, 7.5 hours long. And the style of testing. So this is a big one. It's passage based. So essentially you have a passage, and it depends on the section. You're maybe getting 4 or 5 questions, 5, 6 questions based on the passage. And these passages are adaptations from journal articles. So if you can imagine, if you are reading a journal article about biochemistry, biology, physics, there's a lot of jargon, and it's very difficult to go through unless you've gone through journals and journal articles in the past. So this is a reason why initially students find it difficult, because most of the time, as in my other, in this next point, it's a lot more different than any test you've taken, especially in undergrad. Most undergrad tests aren't passage-based. They're typically one question per, well, it's not passage-based, and there's essentially a single question, and you have multiple answers for that. And then once you're done with that question, you move on. But for the MCAT, understanding the passage is necessary for you to do the question. So if you don't understand the passage, it's unlikely you'll do well on the questions themselves. So this is always a controversy. What's the best way to study? So there are different options, and a lot of the times it depends on how comfortable you are from your undergrad, how well you did in your undergrad, how well you've retained the knowledge, and how well you're able to apply it to the MCAT itself. So the first one is self-studying. So that's relatively affordable. And I'll talk about specific sources in the upcoming slides. But for self-study, it's typically you're going out, seeking out resources, low-cost resources for yourself, and you're essentially studying like how you would in undergrad. So no one's really guiding you, no one's really telling you what to do. You're doing this yourself. So this is what I did. I did self-study, so I'll discuss that a little bit as well. There are also on-demand prep courses. This is a little bit more expensive, but again, these provide a little bit more structure. So you're given the structure to go through different videos, and maybe they have quizzes and those types of things. And for some people, this works. They need that type of structure. Maybe they didn't have the best undergrad experience for a certain discipline, and they want to brush their skills up a little bit before taking the MCAT. So this may be helpful for those types of students. There are also live prep courses, and this can get expensive as well. And these are more geared towards individuals who like live in person, or even in through remote instances through Zoom or other mediums, where you're actually have face to face with a live person. So it's similar to what you've had in undergrad. Maybe you like to go in person, maybe you like to go to office hours with your professors and talk to them about the content and the test. So this may be helpful for those types of individuals. But again, this is very expensive. It can run to thousands of dollars. So again, you need to understand and, I guess, weigh the pros and cons of whether you should self-study or have a live prep course. And finally, you can have like a personal tutor, and this is extremely expensive. But again, this is one-on-one. They're there for you 24/7, and they're essentially picking out areas that are your weakness, and they're focusing on that. So it's very deliberate since it's one-on-one, and it can help you understand what you're struggling on and actually focus on those weaknesses so you can get a higher score. But again, like any other tutor, this is very expensive. And I would say most students do not go this way. They usually self-study or do a on-demand prep course. So to go through some self-study resources, we have the AMC official QBank and the practice test. So the AMC is the organization that administers the MCAT, and they themselves have question banks that reflect the difficulty of the actual test. They also have practice tests that used to be previous MCAT exams that were administered in previous years, and they recycled those as practice tests. So these do cost a little bit of money. They're relatively affordable compared to other companies. And if you do need a fee waiver, they do have that. It's called a fee assistance program. And they essentially look at your financial history, your parents' financial history. And if you do qualify for that, you would get this for free. So I would definitely look into that. And now the main part of this presentation, the spaced repetition app, that's also a great resource, Remnote, Anki. And you can have self-made decks, which are typically recommended because while you're making the deck itself, you're studying in the process. Or you can have pre-made decks. And a couple of popular ones for Anki and Remnote are Miles Down, Jack Sparrow. So these are very comprehensive Anki decks that are based off of certain resources. So most of these are based off of review books like Kaplan or the Princeton Review. And the cool thing about Remnote is if you do have an Anki deck, you can actually import it into Remnote. And with that, you have all the benefits of Anki plus what Remnote offers. So I think the biggest advantage with Remnote is having the ability to see everything all in one place. Anki is the interface with the browse feature isn't very helpful in seeing all the information in one place, but with Remnote, you're able to see that information, you can consolidate it, and it's very quick to review as well when you have that opportunity to see all your notes in one place. As I was mentioning, review books, some popular ones are the Princeton Review, the Kaplan Exam Crackers. So typically these are 7 books that are split based on the actual discipline that's being taught. So the biology textbook, there's a biochemistry, a physics, there's a critical analysis reading section textbook, there's a psychology, sociology. So they've essentially taken these sections and it's more for content review. So this is going over the content itself, the basics, the foundation that you need to actually answer the questions on MCAT. We also have question banks. So arguably, this is the most important part of your MCAT prep. And I'm not sure, maybe probably haven't heard of UWorld. So this is very relevant and popular in the pre-med world and in the med school world. And it's essentially the gold standard for question banks when it comes to MCAT studying or even other standardized tests like the LSAT or Step 1 for med school. We also have Kaplan, Blueprint. These also have their own question banks. The appeal with question banks is it allows you to actively learn. And as Martin was mentioning, active learning is always better than passive learning. So it may be beneficial to actually get into question banks early. And since a lot of these question banks have phenomenal explanations, while you're doing the question, you're actually studying in the process. So an interesting workflow could be as you do a question on UWorld, for example. Let's say you get it wrong and you read their explanation, which for the most part is relevant to the material itself, but it also gives you some background knowledge as well. So it's teaching in a way that it's teaching it in a way for a person that's never seen it before. So that's why it's a really great resource, especially UWorld. So if you do that question and then you miss that question, you can take some of that information from UWorld, make a flashcard in RemNote, and have essentially a database of missed concepts and continuously review those. And RemNote makes this very easy because of the spaced repetition, the scheduling software itself. So it ensures that you'll never miss those types of questions or that discipline again. So I did go over some of these tips and strategies already. For this one, being comfortable with dimensional analysis and doing math for the chemistry physics. So there are no calculators allowed on the MCAT. And what I've seen with other students is they really struggle with the chemistry physics section because you have to first, again, read the passage, extract the pertinent data to answer the question, and you have to do calculations. So a good strategy is actually using dimensional analysis. So for those who don't know what dimensional analysis is essentially taking one unit and converting into another unit. So if you have like miles per hour, you're doing kilometers per hour. If you're doing milliliters and you want to do deciliters, so you know those conversion factors that you should be learning in your chemistry classes and other physics and those types of things. You're learning those skills to analyze the units themselves and essentially working backwards because on the exam, you're given the units. So if you know how to manipulate the units, you can get to the answer, even if you may not understand the underlying foundational concept that well at that moment. Another one is know your high yield topics very well. So I just list some examples here. Amino acids is probably the highest yield, most important topic on the MCAT, full stop. It's always going to be tested. There's always going to be a lot of questions. And if you know that your amino acids well and how they ask about amino acids on the actual exam itself, these should be easy points. So you don't want to miss these types of points. Acid base, thermodynamics, group psychology, landmark psychology experience. So once you go through question banks and other resources, especially the AAMC resources, you'll see a pattern of repeating disciplines and repeating topics. So you want to make a note of which topics come by all the time, and you want to make sure you have a good grasp on those types of topics. And another one, cars. So the cars reading section is essentially similar to if you took the SAT. It's like that, where there's a reading section, you have a passage, and it's usually humanities related or social sciences related. It's not related to any science, so you don't need any outside knowledge to actually complete this section. You're given a passage and you have to answer questions on it. What I've seen is most people struggle on this section a lot. And it's a very hard section because being able to do these types of questions under stress of the MCAT under time pressure is very difficult, because it requires a lot of analysis and understanding, and it isn't as concrete as the science sections, if that makes sense. So what I've seen is individuals who've majored in philosophy or literature or the arts or the social sciences, they actually do better on the car section than individuals who took science majors or were science majors. And why is this the case? Because obviously they were honing their skills of reading and analyzing tough texts in their undergrad. So they've carried over those skills to the MCAT, and it makes sense that they would be getting higher scores in this section. So specifically, I would practice every day, even if it's a single passage, because unlike the other sections, the science sections, you can't really cram for this. This is a skill that builds over time. And even if you do one passage, 5 questions a day for the cars section, you'll be ahead of a lot of other test takers, and it will be reflective on your exam. But you want to make sure that you're trying different strategies, and if one strategy doesn't work, figure out another one and understand how you think and how you actually want to take this section, because there are different strategies. I won't go over them, there's a little too many, but there are different strategies. Find one that works for you, and if it does work, great. If it doesn't, regroup, understand why it doesn't work for you, and try another strategy. And this is another reason why it's important to start early for this section, because if you are switching strategies, you want to have enough time to actually try it out and become proficient in it. And I did allude to this in the previous slide with the Q banks, but practice questions are better than content review. And I know this is maybe a little controversial, because you may be questioning, well, the MCAT is testing on content, right? Well, yes, of course, you have to know the content, and you can't go in without knowing the content. And most people who are getting higher scores, they have a lot of knowledge about the content, very small details. But if you don't know how to apply the concepts that you've learned to the MCAT and questions themselves, it doesn't really matter how much content you know, because you won't get the question right. And again, this goes back to the fact that the MCAT isn't very relatable to tests that you've taken in the past. It's much more critical in the sense that it puts you in novel situations, and you have to use the foundational knowledge that you've learned in your undergrad to apply that knowledge and answer the question in a situation that you may have never seen before. So that's why they're testing your critical thinking skills. And if you think about it, this makes sense. A physician's job is to think critically and be on their feet, think quickly. And this is a beginning, especially the MCAT is the beginning of developing the skill to think critically and apply your foundational knowledge to more conceptual concepts and other difficult concepts. Another one is simulating real testing conditions. This is very important. Again, this is a very long test. You want to build up the stamina. And ideally, you want to take it on the same day that you're going to have your real test. So for example, if you have the test on a Sunday at 8 a.m., you should be doing your full length on Sundays at 8 a.m., if that makes sense. This puts you into a routine. So when the test day actually comes, it seems like another practice test. It should. And if it does feel like another practice test, then you've prepared very well. And another reason for this is it helps ease your nerves because, again, it's hard to fully simulate testing condition, especially the stress part. But if you can put yourself in an environment that allows you to test in a real testing condition, then it would be really helpful in the long run. So you could do this in a library, you can do this at your home. I would prefer the library where it's more realistic and having no content book, having no internet, no Googling things and those types of things. Because again, if you do those things, your full-length exam score, they won't be reflective. It wouldn't be reflective of what you actually know because you use your notes, and on the actual exam, you can't use your notes. So you want to be truthful about what you know. And if you do that early on, you can tackle those weaknesses and get better and get a higher score. Another one is making a list of your incorrects, trouble topics. So you could do this manually, or you could do this in RemNote as well. A thing with spaced repetition is, for example, let's say you have a very difficult card and you keep pressing again on that screen where Martin was showing you. So let's say you press that 6 or 7 times, and this is a setting that you can change, but essentially that card becomes a leech card. And that type of card gets placed in a separate deck. And what that is telling you is that one, maybe that card wasn't made well, so it's not a good card. Or another thing that could be a problem is you don't know the content itself or the testable content on the card. So if that's the case, it's great because you have all this information about your incorrects and your trouble topics, and you can review them consistently with spaced repetition. Or you can also make a table, like an Excel sheet or something like that, and understand why you got the wrong answer. So for example, if you got the wrong answer because you just didn't understand the question, did you mess up on the calculation? Did you forget a important detail in the passage itself? Did you just forget, meaning that you knew the content, but you just forgot? Or you never reviewed it in the first place? So categorizing your incorrects can help you understand where you need the most work. Because if there is a topic, let's say you knew what to do for a math problem, you set up every single thing correctly, but at the end you got the wrong answer because you didn't calculate it correctly. That's unfortunate because again, you knew how to do the problem, you knew the foundational knowledge needed to answer the question, but because of that calculation mistake, you got the question wrong. So that could be rectified very quickly. You can work on your math, you can do some practice problems, and that could be fixed very quickly. And another reason why making a list of your incorrects is so important is because getting problems wrong is what brings your score down by a lot. So another way of putting this is if you keep studying things that you're good at, it's not going to increase your score because there are topics that are bringing your score down and you're not giving them the attention that they need. So this goes back to active learning. Actively understanding what you don't know is very important for the MCAT and in learning in general. And you want to be comfortable being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. So it's easy to review things that you already know. It makes you, gives that dopamine rush and helps you feel that you've gotten something done. But again, it's not really helping you because you're not focusing on your weaknesses. So that's a really big topic, making a list of your incorrects. Another one, I talked about this a little earlier, understanding how certain topics like to be asked on by the AMC, so the company that makes the MCAT. And there are topics on the MCAT that are going to be presented very similarly to your practice exam. So there are, for example, if you have like an amino acid and it's being asked in the practice question in a very specific way, they're pointing you towards a certain direction. You want to understand that. You want to understand, well, the test makers are making me write this because, or making me go this way because they want me to answer the question in a certain way. So if you can understand that, that's part of the test taking strategy part. And that doesn't come from content review, that only comes for practice questions. Hence why practice questions are superior to content review. Because again, this is a standardized exam, and part of the game is understanding how questions are asked. And if you can get that, a lot of the times you can come to the right answer because you know how the test is made, how it was intended to be taken. Another one, I guess this is a more general point. Don't be afraid to reschedule. So you can take, I believe, the MCAT 7 times, unless they've changed it recently. But when I took it, you could take it 7 times in your lifetime, and I believe 2 times in a single year. But ideally, you want to take it once and not again. So one and done. It's okay if you have to retake, but again, ideally, you don't want to restudy for this large test because maybe you didn't study the right way the first time. And it's always better to have one score than two scores, because when you do retake the exam, you run the risk of getting a lower score than your first attempt. And that can be detrimental to your medical school application because the admissions committees may be judging your, I guess, your judgment of whether you should have retaken the exam or you shouldn't have. So again, it's a hard call if you're on the borderline of getting a certain score that you're aiming towards, and maybe you tested that day, something went wrong, and it's completely a different score than you were expecting based on your practice exams and those types of things, then yeah, take it again. That's because maybe something just went wrong that day and you weren't yourself, and maybe it was just a fluke, and take it again and you do well. But again, when you do full lengths, especially the official ones by the AMC, they're very representative, especially if you do it when you're simulating the real testing conditions. They're very representative of what you're likely to get on the exam itself, barring anything extreme happening during the exam itself where you drop a lot of points. So you want to use those full lengths to gauge whether you're ready to take the test, maybe plus or minus 2 or 3 points based on just the fact that it's a standardized exam and some things move around. But for the most part, averages stay around what you've been getting for those full lengths. And lastly, for this, don't compare yourself to others. I know this is a difficult topic. You probably have lots of students and friends and other peers that are taking this exam as well. They may be discussing how well they're doing or how much they're struggling. And a lot of the times you start taking that to heart and start comparing yourself to others. And this can affect your growth and how you look at the test itself and just your abilities. So it can really bring your morale down, and you don't want that happening. Everyone's journey is unique, especially to medical school. I have lots of classmates that are non-traditional. They switch jobs and they're a lot older than the traditional medical student, but it just shows that everyone's journey is unique, and comparison is the thief of joy. So if you do start comparing yourself, it's hard to come out of that cycle of comparing and feeling that you're inadequate to take this test or any test for that matter. So focus on yourself, focus on your strengths, and focus on what you know. And it could, with that, it helps first with your confidence, but also just helps you relieve unnecessary stress that you may be putting on yourself. And it's a difficult concept. It takes a little bit of time. And of course, with social media and all these other things, there are mediums to compare, obviously. But once you stop doing that, it really helps your mental health. It really helps yourself. And in the long run, you'll thank yourself for it. Okay, so now going to myself, a little more personal about how I studied. So like I mentioned, I self-study using low-cost free resources like Remnote, Anki, Khan Academy, for example. Khan Academy has essentially like a whole playlist for each section, and that section is broken down based on certain topics that AMC have deemed important for the MCAT itself. So it's very structured. You can look at that. This is a big one, keeping up with my flashcard reviews. And one of the biggest reasons I've seen people give up on spaced repetition and other things like this is they forget to review their flashcards, or they're just too much. So that's an important thing. And I think we're running out of time here, so I'll speed up. So similar to things, I usually spend more time in active learning and kept myself using QBanks. And like I mentioned, studying for the MCAT is important because essentially it's helping you build that framework and discipline that you need to thrive in medical school. So like Martin was mentioning, this is how I study medical school. It's very basic, but it works. You know, reading lecture, watching lecture, spaced repetition, keeping up with those cards, applying. So this is again active learning, taking an exam, and then this process is repeated. I don't think we have time for this. So Martin did go over the knowledge base, but we can go take some questions. I think that'd be more important.
So this is one question. They wanted to know, in comparison to Anki copy and pasting imageability.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, you can definitely in Remnote or Anki or any other note-taking tool, copy paste things in basically the same way. One very useful trick there is the Windows snipping tool is honestly quite good, especially for taking things from the PowerPoint slides, and learning visually is very important. So yeah, you can paste in the same way.
They want to know, so some people were asking about summer sessions for science courses. Um, the only thing I would add to that is that it's really, really, really hard to do that. And it's just, but if you're able to do it, a lot of people do it. I don't know if Mr. Khan wanted to answer that a little bit, taking hard science courses.
Yeah. Again, it's difficult. I wouldn't take like organic chemistry, physics, and upper level biology all at the same time. You run the risk of not learning the content itself and getting a low grade. And for if you're especially applying to medical, so you want to protect your GPA because the more classes you take, it's harder to bring that GPA up later. And you may need to do additional courses, even a master's possibly to bring up that GPA. So if you are going to take summer courses, take one difficult course, maybe supplement with a less difficult course.
Yeah, and don't work 40 hours a week. And then somebody wanted to ask, and I think this was the question about, can you make templates in Remnote?
Yeah, so there, that's sort of a part of the tags feature. You can basically create a tag and then create a template for that tag. And then whenever you apply that tag, it'll apply the template. So for example, you can make a tag for like my lecture note template, or like this is a medical condition. This is what I want to know for that.
Perfect. All right. Well, we have another event coming up, so we have to run. So sorry about that. But we hope to maybe have Martin join us again in the future
Thanks
since
so much for
there's so
having
many
me. Yeah,
questions. Thank you, guys.
Super
thanks for the good
helpful.
questions. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.